With the recent announcement that The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, the Dunk and Egg spin-off, is going to be made up of a 6-episode first season, it really got me questioning how the show is going to be structured. Yes, we know that each season will most likely be covering one novella, but even then, I would argue some original concepts are going to have to be added in to allow for 6 episodes per season. Not only that, with the idea they plan to make one season per book, what happens when the show finishes adapting the published material? While I do enjoy the books, the way things are left off at the end of the Mystery Knight would hardly make for a satisfying conclusion to a TV show. How will they handle this? Will they create some original stories? Will they get another season based on George R. R. Martin's notes? Could they use the TV show as a way to allow George R. R. Martin a way to finish telling his story, given that they will be doing a book per season, and there are currently 3 published Dunk and Egg novellas, The Hedge Knight, The Sworn Sword, and The Mystery Knight. It means if they only adapt published material, the show will run for 3 seasons. Now, we do know that George R. R. Martin intends for there to be a 4th novella called The She-Wolves of Winterfell, but we will get to that later. Now, even at 6 episodes per season, it will be some tough work to stretch it across that many episodes. The books are, after all, short stories. Thus, I think it's a given they will be bulking out the season with supplementary material. Namely, in the first season, I think they will greatly expand upon Bloodraven's role and find some way of introducing him during season 1. I also think they will spend a little time giving the viewer backstory on the first Blackfyre Rebellion, maybe via some flashbacks, given how big of a role it plays in the story of the Sworn Sword and the Mystery Knight. When it comes to season 2, it's a little bit more tricky, as there is not too much room in the story where you could add in any new plot lines. However, I suspect with season 2, what they could do is split the season up into 2 parts, with the second half being a straight up adaptation of the Sworn Sword. Something that gets established at the start of the second novella is between the Hedge Knight and the Sworn Sword, Dunk and Egg spend a lot of time in Dorne, as well as visiting Maester Aemon in Old Town. I could see them bringing this part of their adventure to screen, especially with how little of Dorne we saw in Game of Thrones and how poorly it was handled. It could possibly be a chance of redemption somewhat. I don't think HBO could resist showing a young Maester Aemon, even if it was for a single episode. Any change they get to link Dunk and Egg back into Game of Thrones, I expect them to try and take it. Spreading the Mystery Knight over 6 episodes, for me, is a lot less of an issue than the first 2 novellas, namely because, as a story, is a bit more complex, with more parallel plot lines happening. I also think they're going to spend a lot more time with John the Fiddler, aka Daemon II Blackfyre, and his relationship with Duncan, so the twist that he is in fact Daemon hits even harder for the viewers. I suspect, depending on what the situation is, with a possible season 4, they could spend an episode as sort of an epilogue, with Bloodraven playing a big role in it. I do think the first Blackfyre Rebellion is going to play a significant role in the show, as a spectre looming over it. It already is in the novellas, but I suspect it will be even more so in the show for 2 simple reasons. Firstly, so far, none of the A Song of Ice and Fire TV shows have really delved into House Blackfyre or the rebellions too much, so it would be a great way to slowly introduce them into the show lore. Secondly, I suspect in terms of the successor show to House of the Dragon, other than the in-development Aegon's Conquest show, a spin-off about the reign of King Aegon IV and the first Blackfyre Rebellion would be the next obvious time period for a spin-off. It would give viewers everything they liked about Game of Thrones' first few seasons, with a lot of politics and plotting going on, characters you want to hate like Aegon IV, and huge battles like the Redgrass Field. They could use Dunk and Egg to gauge whether there's hunger for this kind of spin-off. There are some issues with the Blackfyre idea that will have its own video, however, mainly to do with Bloodraven, and the direction Game of Thrones went with him. For a lot of fans, with Game of Thrones past the published books is really when the quality in terms of the writing started to fall down. Mix in the butterfly effect are some of the changes the writers made from the books in the early seasons, and it all led to an end product that for many was disappointing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and debate who's to blame for that. The writers for frankly poor writing, or George R. R. Martin for failing to publish a main series book since 2011. But the point is, the writers will have that same issue with Dunk and Egg after season 3, if they do decide to carry on without any published books to work from. It is very possible they will stop at season 3, but I kind of get the feeling they won't want to leave the story incomplete. While there is a slim possibility that George R. R. Martin could release The She-Wolves of Winterfell within the next 6 years or so, I think it is highly unlikely to happen. And unless maybe George R. R. Martin has a large amount of it written and unpublished, it would mean going into season 4, they would have no source material to work from, which really does present a huge issue for the writers, especially as we don't know how fleshed out the unpublished stories are in George's mind. For me, the biggest issue when it comes to the Night of the Seven Kingdoms is what the writers will do after season 3, and they run out of novellas. For many fans, the biggest issue with the writing of Game of Thrones came when they ran out of book to adapt, and openly abandoned and changed plot lines from the books, completely removing some. Rightly, fans are nervous what will happen when the same thing happens to Dunk and Egg. Now, we do know that George R. R. Martin's plans for the 4th novella, The She-Wolves of Winterfell, with the ending of the Mystery Night hinting at Dunk and Egg going north as well. While I think that the novella is a long way off, and maybe will never happen, I suspect that George very much has it planned out, with extensive notes about it. And with George R. R. Martin said to be working closely with the writers of The Night of the Seven Kingdoms, I do see a situation where they could maybe adapt The She-Wolves of Winterfell with George's outline and his help in the writing. George R. R. Martin has also said he has a 5th novella roughed out in his head, with the working title, The Village Hero, set to take place in the Riverlands. So perhaps if he does write some notes about it, and again with George's guidance to the writers, they might be able to do something with that. We also know the names of the final 4 planned novellas: The Sellsword, The Champion, The Kingsguard, The Lord Commander. While we cannot work out much about the first 2, I suspect the Kingsguard will take place during the 4th Blackfyre Rebellion, with Duncan, now a member of Aegon's Kingsguard, with the Battle of the Wendwater Bridge the focus of the novella, and I suspect that the Lord Commander will cover the events of Summerhall. So while, of course, adapting without books would be a challenge, with the right writers and close involvement from George R. R. Martin, there may be a path forward which allows them to carry on the show past season 3. However, unless they are 100% confident in the writing and the story they are telling, I would rather them leave it be at season 3. Ever since it was announced there was going to be a Dunk and Egg TV show, there has been a lot of speculation that due to George R. R. Martin's role in the production of it, that he might be using it as a platform to finish telling the stories he knows he has little chance of completing in print. I can see why this would be both appealing to fans and to George in a way. It's a tricky idea, because I would always prefer the book get published, but if this is the only way we ever get to see the end of the story, is not something I would exactly turn down. I think in this case it really would come down to how much George would want to actively be involved in the project, given the looming presence of the Winds of Winter. Anyway, what I'm curious about is when it comes to the idea of the Night of the Seven Kingdoms eventually running out of novellas to adapt, is what you guys as fans want them to do. Would you want them to stop at season 3? Would you want them to try and make something work with the rough outlines George has for the She-Wolves of Winterfell and the Village Hero? How do you feel about the idea of George using the TV show as a way to finish telling his story? Let me know in the comments, because I want to make a follow-up video delving into this.